conversations, I'm always reminded of something I should be using that I'm not. It's just unbelievable the amount of information available there. So thank you for all that great work. You seeing my slides okay? Hearing me okay?
Yep, looks great. Sounds good.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Montana's State Wildlife Action Plan. And we'll go through the kind of who, what, where, when, why of the State Wildlife Action Plan, but I want to focus, of course, most of the time on how forestry and forest management, or how the SWAP kind of applies to that in the state, and then talk a little bit at the end about where things are headed for the next SWAP revision. So what is the State Wildlife Action Plan? The SWAP identifies community types, focal areas, and species in Montana with significant issues that warrant conservation attention. This plan was developed primarily by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. We are the agency that was required to make it, but it is used by countless other agencies and organizations across the state. You'll see it referenced in funding applications. Land trust agencies use it. Other state and federal agencies use it. So it's really meant to be a global plan for everybody to use when it comes to specifically non-game wildlife in the state. Why was the State Wildlife Action Plan developed, or why is it developed? The primary reason being that we can get federal funding from the State Wildlife Grant Program. In order to take advantage of that funding, we have to have a State Wildlife Action Plan. So when this funding mechanism was created, all 50 states and all the territories all came up with their own individual State Wildlife Action Plans. So it's basically a way to document how we would want to spend that money to address wildlife habitat and non-game wildlife. And also sort of a global reason, FWP is mandated to manage every species in the state, not just species that are hunted, fished, or trapped. So we have grizzly bear management plans, we have elk management plan, we have mountain lion management plan, we have fisheries management plans. This is kind of like the non-game management plan in a way for the state. Who develops the SWAT? I'm going to say SWAT about 20 times, but I mean SWAP. There was a mostly FWP internal staff. So there's kind of the higher ups in Helena were on the steering committee. And then we had aquatic and terrestrial teams, i.e. fisheries biologists and wildlife biologists, at least one representative from each of the 7 FWP administrative regions in the state. And then there's also an external technical team, which included agency folks and some people from some of the big nonprofits that work at sort of landscape level conservation stuff. And then because it is a state agency document, there is a public comment process, and we take those into account when updating the plan. So who will be developing it? This kind of hints at the fact that the State Wildlife Action Plan has to be updated and revised every 10 years. And these tend to be fairly major revisions where we try to improve upon it, document some of our successes, and document some things that have become new worries or new concerns in the state. So looking into the future, the next revision is coming up in 2025, so it's sneaking up on us already. So we'll probably be using a lot of that same structure, those same partners, those same agency folks to do this next revision. But we also have some really cool new resources coming to play in the non-game program. We have a whole new head of our non-game program, Christina Smucker. For the first time, we've hired a dedicated staff person to help with the State Wildlife Action Plan updates. We have a SWAP coordinator. We'll also have a non-game dedicated biometrician, as well as a new bat biologist and a few other new staff as well. So we have new resources to bear. We have a dedicated person working on this revision. So hopefully it'll be the best version of the SWAP we've ever had. So a quick rundown of how the SWAP is organized. You'll see a lot of themes you've already seen from Bryce's talk. A lot of the information compiled, analyzed, and created by the National Heritage Program is basically what fed into creating the SWAPs. You'll see a lot of sort of reoccurring things happening here. So we have community types of greatest conservation need, CTGN. So these are basically broad ecological systems or vegetation communities, basically that are considered to house a lot of the species and habitats that we're worried about. Then there are geographically defined areas known as focal areas that may contain many different community types of greatest conservation need, or just many different community types generally. And then there are species of greatest conservation need, which are analogous to species of concern. Those terms are pretty much interchangeable. And then species of greatest inventory needs. So species of greatest conservation need are those that have been ranked by the Natural Heritage Program using a bunch of different criteria related to their populations and their habitats and future threats and trends. So like an S1 species would be one we're really, really worried about. S4, not so much worried about, but we want to keep an eye on it. And then species of greatest inventory need are ones where we don't really have enough information to make a really good ranking in terms of their species of concern or species of greatest conservation need status. So those are ones that we're targeting for more surveys to really figure out what their status is. And then there's sections of the SWOP on current impacts, future threats, and conservation actions. Those are generally grouped together. Here's an example for the short-nosed gar that just kind of lays it out in table form. And finally, at the end, there's a section on how we monitor our ability to address the conservation concerns in the State Wildlife Action Plan and kind of revision schedules and things like that. So the stuff at the top there is kind of like the data, the sort of physical species and areas that we're concerned about. And then the other two sections kind of speak back directly to those things. So there you go. That's SWOP 101. That's pretty much how the whole thing works and how it's organized. Let's get to what may be a little more applicable to what we're talking about today, which is where does forestry, forested areas, and forest management come in with all of this information that's in the SWOP. There are 12 terrestrial community types of greatest conservation need. Luckily for you all, only 3 of those are really directly tied to timber management and timber harvest and landscape, that being floodplain and riparian, and then the 2 major conifer-dominated forest types, the Mesig wet, which is far northwest Montana and sort of the western edge of Montana down through the Bitterroots, and then the xeric mesig, which is pretty much all the other forest areas in the state. But there are others that may come up. You can kind of see the list there of some others that are often innervated with forested areas or some of those sort of special habitat patches I talked about earlier. And then all aquatic community types of greatest conservation need are pretty relevant to forestry. Aquatic is defined a little differently. Basically, every stream and river in the state is considered a community type of greatest conservation need. And then a few select lakes and reservoirs, most of which are forested around them. So thinking about things like loon nests and bald eagle nests, they may be more associated with those lakes and reservoirs, but they're also dependent on those forested areas around those water bodies. So kind of harkening back to that long section of my talk that was all about special habitat patches, you can start to see these sort of common themes running throughout here. We had those floodplains, wetlands, riparian areas, and streams that were considered, one of the tippy-top most important special habitat patches in forested areas for wildlife and biodiversity. Grasslands and sagebrush areas, those kind of open, winter range type stuff, and meadows and things like that. And then those deciduous dominated forests and woodlands and deciduous shrublands, talking about aspen stands and avalanche shoots and those sorts of places. So there's a reason I pointed those out in my first talk as these sort of special habitat patches, because they are recognized not just by me, but by Natural Heritage Program and by the State Wildlife Action Plan as really important habitat types for non-game wildlife and for biodiversity. But the big focus here, of course, is on these forested areas, conifer forested areas. This is basically a way to say that no matter what, if you're working in a forested area in the state, you're pretty much going to be in a community type of greatest conservation need. And so you have hopefully some impetus to take on the special responsibility of dealing with an important habitat type like that. So there on the left is the Mesig or wet forest types, that far northwestern and western spine of the state, and then the much larger and more broad xeric mesig forest types on the right. And down at the bottom are some of the tree species that are associated with those. So in the State Wildlife Action Plan, each one of these community types gets its own kind of entry, its own few pages of information. You'll see a quick description of what it is and why it's important to non-game wildlife. And then you'll actually get a list of associated species of greatest conservation need, again, generated in basically the exact same way that Bryce just showed you, that you can kind of generate those species lists for individual ownerships or community types or focal areas, whatever it may be, through all that information the Natural Heritage Program provides. So I'm just bringing these up now because I'm going to talk about them again in a little bit, but just know that there's associated SGCN lists for the community types as well as focal areas. So focal areas, again, can contain many different community types of greatest conservation need and other community types as well. There are a lot of them. There's 93 aquatic, 55 terrestrial that are in the tier 1 or highest priority category, and another 164 aquatic and 61 terrestrial in the tier 2, or still a priority, but more secondary to the tier 1s. And then selected out of all of those tier 1 aquatic and terrestrial priority areas or focal areas are these sort of tippy top biggest ones of most concern. And all of these were kind of developed with expert opinion, habitat modeling, and sort of input from all of our partners. And they are delineated based on hydrologic unit codes. So just to kind of show you a map, this is just the terrestrial focal areas in the state. Green is tier 1, blue is tier 2. You know, if we put the aquatic ones up there on as well, there aren't many parts of the state that aren't within a focal area. At least the vast majority of the state is within at least one kind of focal area. And then those orange ones are those 14 tippy top most concern focal areas identified within the State Wildlife Action Plan. But just to kind of show you an example of what one of those entries looks like in the actual plan, we have, you know, a map of that delineated area, a brief description of why it was established as a focal area, you know, a few paragraphs, few sentences on the importance of it. And then again, a nice list of associated species of greatest conservation need. And then in these focal areas, because they can contain many community types, you actually get a list of what those CTGCN are as well. So unlike the community types, which are guaranteed you're going to be in one because the forested areas are all included, you might be able to escape being in a focal area, but there's a pretty high chance that you're going to be in or near one, no matter where you are. So what does it mean for you if your ownership falls within a focal area? At the very basic sense, it means that you have a higher potential of your habitat management, your habitat manipulations affecting a greater number of community types and species of greatest conservation need. Alongside that, you can also expect that there may be some sort of listed species in that area as well, listed under Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So if you find you're in a swap, good to check the description of why it was included in the swap, see how that might relate to forest management, and then look at those current impacts, future threats, and conservation actions section to see what has been identified as some of the most concerning past impacts, current impacts, and future threats directly related to that focal area that may be applicable to forest management. And then another really useful thing is to take those species of greatest conservation need lists and see if there are specific species that can kind of be your focal species that you can or should manage for. And I'll show you here in a little bit kind of how to whittle down these very long lists of species you get to really hone in on those kind of focal species you may want to worry about. And again, I always like to remind you, your local fish and wildlife biologists with FWP are here to be consulted with on this kind of stuff. So if it's just too much, you're not sure which direction to go, you can't whittle down the list, it seems, always feel free to reach out to one or several of us. So let's do some list whittling. As we get into the section about species of greatest conservation need, there are 128 vertebrate species of greatest conservation need that are included within the data behind the State Wildlife Action Plan. So that includes all species listed as S1, S2, or S3. The S4 species are not included in the State Wildlife Action Plan. 47 species are individually highlighted in the swap, and those are the ones that are listed as S1 and S2. I don't include invertebrates or plants in the State Wildlife Action Plan yet. Hopefully, if there's more funding and greater staff time available in the future, that will be something we could incorporate maybe into the 2035 revision or something like that. So let's break it down a little bit. We have 128 species of greatest conservation need, S1 through S3. And I know that Bryce kind of did a very similar breakdown here. I think we may have had slightly different criteria, different goals here, but this is just kind of to give you the general sense that there is a good way to sort of whittle down these lists. So I kind of did this exercise on my own. for a different part of the earlier talk I had. But basically, of those 128, 82 are not really associated with forested areas. It's generally species that are associated with large wetland complexes or species associated with the grasslands and sagebrush seas of eastern and central Montana, so outside the kind of forested areas. There's another 11 species that are associated with forests, but generally timber management has little to no effect on them. So these are alpine species that are kind of at such high elevation that you generally don't have to worry about them, and they're just sort of outside the actively managed, actively harvested landscapes, or they occupy habitat patches that are generally unaffected by timber management activities. So getting in the ones you may actually want to worry about, there's 17 where timber management has sort of indirect effects. These are generally, a lot of them are associated with streams, wetlands, and riparian areas, again, emphasizing the importance of those habitat types. So these may be some important focal species for your special habitat patches. And then another 18 where timber management definitely has direct effects. So these could be more of your focal species for the actual forested areas where you'll be doing your harvest. 2 of those are primarily aquatic or riparian dependent. 8 are associated with old growth trees or old growth forest patches. And then the others are kind of a mix. There's 3 bat species. There's the Canada lynx that uses multiple different forest types. There's blackback woodpeckers that are burn specialists. Varied thrush that like dark wet forests, not necessarily associated with a certain age structure. And so again, the sort of habitat needs of these different species can really tell you a lot about what you might want to worry about in terms of wildlife habitat on your ownership. So putting all that together, there's about 35 species of greatest conservation need that you would need to worry about. The sort of special habitat patch species, and then the true forest dwellers. Now, someone else like Bryce or a person in another region might go through that same exercise and come up with slightly different numbers. But for the most part, that's a pretty accurate representation. So already we've whittled down that list quite a bit. So at this point, I am going to do a Bryce Maxwell, as they say, and switch over to some reports straight from Natural Heritage Program, those environmental summaries that Bryce was just talking about. So this is taken straight from an environmental summary for a conservation easement property that we're working on here in the Bitterroot Valley. The only manipulations I've made is I tried to delete a bunch of columns to maybe simplify things a little bit for looking at it. And I'm just working with species that have shown up in this environmental report. And then I sorted it based on species group as the first tier, and then by habitat as the second tier. So we have our species occurrences, we have other observations, and we have potential species all sorted that way and kind of simplified. So this can be a good place to start. And then, you know, based on what you know about the property, based on that habitat modeling that Bryce was talking about, and kind of being out on the ground, you can maybe start to just delete species off of this list and try to whittle it down to get a small number of species for you to kind of look into. So for this one, I'm kind of making this up for this property, but let's say we didn't have any cliffs or major rock outcroppings, no real wetlands and riparian areas. The ones we do have, we're just the sort of plan for it is to just put buffers on them and leave them alone. We're not going to worry about species that are more generalists, and we don't have any major burned areas on the property or any plan for there to be major burned areas as part of the management plan for that property. So by doing that, and by looking at these habitat associations, you can already start deleting some species off this list that you maybe don't need to worry about, like black swifts, you know, the veery. You know, if you don't have streams or rivers or lakes on the property, you could delete those fish. And so you can really start to whittle things down just by knowing a few things about kind of those special habitat patches. And so what I did with this list, these 3 lists, is I just went through, pretended that this was my situation down here, and then kind of deleted those species I don't necessarily need to worry about. And I came up with these fairly short lists of species that could be my kind of focal species based on the habitat associations. And so from there, you've got a fairly short list. You might pick a few out that you definitely know that people are concerned about. You might send this, send this Excel file to me or to another non-game biologist in the state and just say, hey, can you have a look at this? Let me know which species you think I should really look out for here. And then straight from this Excel file, you can click these EL codes and go straight to the Montana Field Guide, and then go down and look at potential habitat associations, what you might want to look for or manage for on your property. So it's a lot of those kind of lists that you can get out of these environmental summaries can be pretty overwhelming. This is kind of an easy way to whittle things down and try to get at that idea of having some focal species to home in on. The one thing I should have left up here are those habitat modeling percentages of that Bryce was pointing out, the moderate, I can't remember the exact categories, but that could be another good thing to compare and say, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to have these species because I potentially have these habitat types on this landscape, but then look at those percentages and say, okay, do I really have enough of that habitat that I should really be concerned about that species? So one that pops up to me for this particular habitat or this particular ownership, I'm not too worried about Tennessee warblers based on what I know about that. I would imagine if I had those percentages up there, we'd see that a fairly low percent of potential habitat for Tennessee warblers. And again, always want to emphasize, I tend to do that. We really like people to try to go through that exercise themselves. It's really good for people to kind of learn how to do that and figure out how to do that for their own landscapes. But if it's just too much, I've done this for a lot of people where they show me the ownership, I'll pull out that report, whittle down that list, and then just provide some general recommendations. So we are available for that kind of consultation as well. Going through the rest of the SWOP, I'll go through this real quickly. The current threats, future impacts, and conservation actions. These are grouped for community types and focal areas. So there are these 3 broad actions for all community types, really broad categories of things we can do. Don't get into too many specifics. And then there are a few specific actions related to some of the terrestrial community types. So I pulled out a few that are related to forestry, like development, road densities, corridors, and connectivity I talked about earlier. And you'll see these very general terms, altered fire regimes being a current threat, future impact for forested areas, but we don't have many sort of specific recommendations on what that means you're supposed to do for specific habitats. That would be something we're really hopefully going to be able to incorporate into the state wildlife action plan someday, is get much more specific about specifically the conservation actions, and maybe have them applicable to really specific community types in the future if we have the time and energy. There are species-specific actions for those 47 species that are considered most critical, those S1 and S2 species of greatest conservation need. Those all get their own table. This one's for Idaho giant salamander. Again, you can see current impact, incompatible forest management practice, future impact, incompatible forest management practice, conservation action, try not to do incompatible forest management practices. So we don't have a lot of really specific stuff on things like that. There are some more specific things about, replacing culverts, actual sort of life history traits of the species to look out for. But this is something we'd really, really like to beef up in future revisions of the state wildlife action plan so that people can look up a particular species or a particular habitat type and know, specifically what are some things they could do to try to help that species or that habitat. So I'll kind of skip through this next section so we have time for questions. Not really too applicable to forest management, but basically there's a revision schedule for the SWOP. The species of greatest conservation need and inventory need are updated pretty much constantly by the Natural Heritage Program when new information comes in. And then hopefully in the future, we'll have a really robust implementation plan. And then there's also individual projects that can provide updates. Those are just a few of the current measures of effectiveness. This monitoring part will be another big change, hopefully for the 2025 revision. We'll have a lot more robust standards for how we're going to monitor our progress towards addressing the things that are outlined in the SWOP. So with that, I'll take any questions you have. If we don't have any particular questions on the SWOP, maybe I can go back to some of those questions I missed during my first talk. If we have time here, it looks like we may have a few minutes.
Torrey, can I chime in on just a couple things?
Sure.
I realize that people may get confused between SGCN and SOC. And in Montana, just want everybody to know it's the exact same thing. If you're a species of greatest conservation need in the state wildlife action plan, you're a species of concern, at least for vertebrates. And that means you're S1, S2, or S3. And then the second, two other things. One was just beware that the habitat names will change between swaps because we're going to be moving to the new National Vegetation Classification Scheme. But I would say the boundaries will probably be the same. And then third, we both went through our number counting things, and it made me realize that I hadn't noted that there's a separation between G1, G2 species that folks may need to consider for SFI standards versus the species of concern. Not all G1, G2s are actually species of concern because some of the G1, G2s we're finding mysterious enough. We just don't have enough information on them that we're not listing them as species of concern. So that there is a difference there where, gosh, if I want to be SFI certified, I've got to actually go to the G1, G2 list. I can't just use that standard SOC list. So, all right, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for those clarifications, Bryce. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Torrey, for the presentation. Thanks, Bryce, for the additions there. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat box now. So yeah, we've got a couple minutes that we have left in time before our scheduled break. So Torrey, if you don't mind, we can jump back to some of those original questions from your first presentation.
Sure.
And